Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 2 at Madison Area Technical College. This is your third lecture for week 12, and in this lecture we will talk about how the body performs pH balance or acid-base balance. And we're all familiar with the pH scale by this point, ranging from 0 to 14. Below 7, it's considered more acidic. Any solution is considered more acidic, and above 7, a solution is considered more basic. So the pH of a solution is determined by its hydrogen ion concentration. There's a mathematical formula for calculating it that involves taking the inverse of the log of the hydrogen ion concentration. You won't be performing that in this class, performing that mathematical calculation. It's important that you know that 7 is neutral, and so the amount of acid is equal to the amount of base. A pH below 7 is considered more acidic, and that is there is more hydrogen ions around or acids around than base. And a pH above 7, more basic, because there is less hydrogen ions or less acid around than there is base. Another way to define an acid or a base versus using the pH scale and just the concentration of acid versus base is to describe what an acid actually does chemically. And what it does is donate a hydrogen ion into solution. A hydrogen ion, you might remember, is also called a proton because it doesn't have any electrons. And an acid might be strong or it might be weak. It depends on how readily it releases the hydrogen ion into solution. A base, in contrast, can be defined chemically as a substance that accepts hydrogen ions, that is, that binds to hydrogen ions that are already present in a solution. And again, a base might be strong or weak depending on how easily it binds to hydrogen ions. It's a strong base if it readily takes up hydrogen ions. It's a weaker base if it takes more time, essentially, to bind to the hydrogen ions. Our body fluids have pretty stable pH levels, including inside our cells, the cytoplasm, which is basically a pH of 7. And our extracellular fluids are usually somewhere around 7.4, slightly basic. So the fluid found in between cells or interstitial fluid has a pH of around 7.4, as does lymphatic fluid or lymph. Cerebral spinal fluid, slightly more acidic, but there's a certain pH for even the fluid in body cavities and synovial fluid in our joints and the aqueous humor in the eye. But what we're going to talk about today most of the time here is what is the pH of blood plasma? What's the pH of blood? And again, you could say it's 7.4, but it's kept within a really narrow range of 7.35 to 7.45. And so we're going to look at how that can happen. But first, we're going to look at why. So it is important for the pH to be maintained, or the acid-base balance to be maintained, because the structure of proteins is largely dependent on hydrogen ion concentration. And protein structure dictates how well it's going to function. So any slight deviation in pH could cause the structure of the protein to kind of fall apart. We call that denaturation. So remember, proteins have a quaternary structure, a tertiary structure, a secondary structure. If pH is imbalanced, they could unfold, and therefore they don't have the right conformation to perform whatever their function is. And remember that enzymes are proteins. And without enzymes, all our metabolic pathways would shut down or at least not be performed as well. And homeostasis could not be achieved in all the organ systems, essentially. So pH balance is really important. Now, as humans and land animals, and the way our metabolism works is that we constantly produce excess hydrogen ions or acids. We produce lactic acid by anaerobic fermentation in order to produce a little bit of ATP when oxygen's not around in some cells. We produce phosphoric acid from the breakdown of proteins and nucleic acid. We make fatty acids and ketone bodies when we break down fats. And our cells are always producing carbon dioxide, and so we make carbonic acid. And of course, you know, we make stomach acid, HCl. So that's one big challenge to us maintaining pH balance of our fluids, especially the blood. There are many sources of hydrogen ions in our metabolism. There aren't as many sources of base, meaning we don't produce bases as commonly, but there are bases present in our body to act as buffers. For example, remember that pancreatic juice and bile are both alkaline. And so they have bicarbonate in them, which is an anion that can bind to hydrogen ions. This is bicarbonate ion here. But it's not like our metabolism breaks down everything and produces acids. Our body specifically makes this bicarbonate in order to buffer acid. And we'll talk about what buffering means in a little bit. Now, another source of base would be not endogenous, but could be ingested. Like when we ingest antacids, like Tums or something, that'll be a base. Okay, let's talk about what a buffer is. A buffer is any mechanism that resists a change in pH. And it does so by releasing or binding hydrogen ions. So it's all about hydrogen ion concentration. Now there are different types of buffers in our body. There are 3 different types of chemical buffers present in our body fluids, and they're going to correct for just minor fluctuations in pH. Then there are physiological buffers. These are entire organ systems, the urinary system and the respiratory system specifically, that can correct for more extreme pH disturbances. So one of your study questions asks to state whether or not each buffer can correct a pH that has become completely abnormal, like beyond 8 or below 6. And that would be only physiological buffers. They can do much more. But of course the chemical buffers would act first, and then the organ systems would kick in. So let's talk about response time. So the chemical buffers can act within a fraction of a second by just immediately binding an excess acid or base temporarily. The respiratory system then would kick in if there was still an imbalance. And that respiratory system kicks in between 1 to 3 minutes, so pretty quickly. And the way it happens is all by controlling the level of CO2 eliminated by the respiratory system. CO2 is a volatile acid, and if we change the rate at which we breathe, we can get rid of more or less CO2, and that would then increase the amount of acid in our body, We'll talk about it in more detail in a minute. Now, the urinary system is the last to kick in, but it will last the longest as well. It acts within hours or a day. And this can directly rid the body of hydrogen ions, or retain them, but usually rid the body of hydrogen ions, and retain base, or rid the body of base. And the base that is either retained or eliminated is bicarbonate, typically. So the urinary system will directly eliminate hydrogen ion versus the respiratory system eliminates CO2, which I'll explain why CO2 is acidic in a little bit. Let's first talk about chemical buffers in more detail. So what is a chemical buffer? There's two general components of a chemical buffer. It's a solution, it's a mixture of a weak acid and a weak base. And this weak acid or this weak base in the chemical buffer can neutralize the hydrogen ion concentration if a strong acid is introduced to the body, or if a strong base is introduced into the body. So when a strong acid is introduced to the body in some fashion, that means that hydrogen ions are increasing in the body. And so the weak base of the chemical buffer will bind to those hydrogen ions and take them out of solution, thereby raising the pH. When a strong base is introduced, in contrast, that weak acid will release a hydrogen ion and bind to that particular base. Okay? And so it changes the amount of base that's in the solution, and will actually lower the pH because hydrogen ions have been released. So each chemical buffer functions within an ideal pH range, and we'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later. So, given that a chemical buffer is a mixture of a weak acid and a weak base, what are the chemical buffers in our body fluids? They're proteins. We call this the protein buffer system. There's a phosphate buffer system that works in the kidneys and a little bit in the blood plasma, but mainly in the kidneys. And then there's this bicarbonate buffer system, and it works in the blood, the lungs, and the kidneys. But the protein buffer system is just the presence of proteins in our bodies, like albumin in the plasma, proteins that are on the surface of cells, proteins that are floating around in intracellular fluid, proteins that are in extracellular fluid. So it accounts, this protein buffer system accounts for 75% of all chemical buffering that our body is able to do. And so I can't stress it enough that it's really important. So we're going to look at how proteins can be both a weak acid and a weak base. So in the middle of this slide, I show a generic amino acid. Not a whole protein, but one amino acid. And remember, an amino acid has a central carbon that's bound to a hydrogen. It's bound to a carboxyl group, an amine group, and a side chain, which can vary depending on which of the 20 amino acids you're talking about, and we just use the letter R. So the amino groups of all proteins and all amino acids can actually accept a hydrogen ion. So if the pH falls and it drops really low, that means there's lots of hydrogen around, and those hydrogens will be bound up on the amine end of the protein. So the amine group is the weak base. If instead the pH rises, and so in that case, we have fewer hydrogen ions around. This carboxyl group can release the hydrogen ion, and that will lower the pH of the fluid. So that's the carboxyl group acts as the weak acid. Now we'll look at the chemical buffer known as a phosphate buffer. Phosphate groups, you might remember, have a central phosphorus with bound to 4 oxygens, and some of those oxygens bind to hydrogen. They can all bind to hydrogen because oxygen is so electronegative that it would steal an electron from hydrogen and bind to it. But let's look at how a specific phosphate buffer works. Again, we're going to have a mixture of a weak acid and a weak base. The weak base is called sodium monohydrogen phosphate. That means there's one hydrogen, which means there's room for another one. But anyway, and the weak base is sodium dihydrogen phosphate. So here we've got 2 hydrogens in this case. So this solution, this mixture of a weak acid and a weak base coexisting together, means that substitution reactions can occur when either a strong acid or strong base is introduced. So let's say that a strong acid is introduced into this buffering system. And remember, the buffering system contains both the weak base and the weak acid. But if you introduce a strong acid, what's going to be used is this weak base. And so here's the weak base down here, sodium monohydrogen phosphate. And the strong acid I chose just randomly is hydrochloric acid. And so hydrochloric acid readily dissociates into H, hydrogen ion, and a chloride anion. And so the hydrogen ion will actually bind to the sodium. And so then you have left over a sodium that falls off of the weak base and combines with the chloride ion, and you get salt. So that's how the phosphate buffer works when a strong acid is introduced. When a strong base is introduced, like sodium hydroxide, then we're going to be using the weak acid as the buffering component. And so sodium hydroxide will dissociate into sodium ions, I should say cations, and hydroxyl ions or hydroxide ions. Those are anions. So that's the base that's been introduced. What we already have in the fluid is this sodium dihydrogen phosphate. And it will take up another sodium. But in the process, it loses a hydrogen. So it becomes Na2HPO4, which is the weak base that we originally talked about. But what's left over is this anion, the hydroxide group. It will bind to one of those hydrogens and form water. So that's how the phosphate group buffer works. And it's particularly important in the kidney and in the cytoplasm, because that's where there's so much phosphate. Now we're going to look at the bicarbonate buffer system. It is found in many places. Extracellular fluids, particularly the blood. It's also linked to the respiratory system, and the urinary system uses it. So we're going to just look at the chemistry first, and then we'll see some examples of how it's used by the blood, the kidney, and the respiratory system. So it's a mixture of a weak base and a weak acid. The weak base is sodium bicarbonate, shown here in green. And the weak acid is carbonic acid, which you have seen before. So this combination, this mixture, could buffer either a strong acid or a strong base. So let's take the example of a strong acid being introduced into this mixture. So a strong acid, and the one I'm going to choose is hydrochloric acid. It's written in blue in that chemical equation right here. So since hydrochloric acid is a strong acid, what we'll be using is that weak base to buffer it. And again, just a substitution reaction happens. We get sodium binding to the chloride ion and the bicarbonate, HCO3, binding to the hydrogen. So it's a substitution reaction. You get a salt and the formation of carbonic acid. If instead the buffer is trying to buffer a strong base like sodium hydroxide, then you will have the sodium binding and binding to the HCO3, displacing a hydrogen ion, and the hydrogen ion will bind to the hydroxide to produce water. So the end result when the bicarbonate buffering system is exposed to a strong base is water and sodium bicarbonate. So this is particularly important in the blood. There is both sodium bicarbonate and carbonic acid present in our bloodstream as a buffering system. And so sodium bicarbonate, since it's a base, can raise the pH of our blood. And it does so by dissociating and producing this bicarbonate ion, which binds up the excess hydrogens. So that would raise the pH. It can also lower the pH because it has carbonic acid, and if carbonic acid dissociates, you produce hydrogen ions, and that would lower the pH. So that's the last of the chemical buffers. No more chemistry, yay! But I did mention that the respiratory system and the urinary system both use this bicarbonate buffer system to some extent. Not so much with the sodium, but definitely carbonic acid. So let's look at these physiological buffers. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, the respiratory system can correct more than a chemical buffer, or at least it'll kick in after the chemical buffers and help us change our pH even more. So it responds to acid base imbalances a little bit stronger than chemical buffers, not in terms of percentage buffered, but in terms of degree of pH value. So those chemical buffers can change minor fluctuations, but the respiratory system can change the pH by many levels. But it's still weaker than what the urinary system can do. The urinary system has the strongest response to acid-base imbalances, and it's so powerful because it can either eliminate acid or base from the body, not just bind up or release hydrogen ions. So let's look at how the respiratory system performs acid-base balance. It's based entirely on our production of carbon dioxide and the fact that we are basically aqueous, or we are a bunch of cells in an aqueous environment, and so carbonic acid is produced all the time. And carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So the respiratory system produces well, I shouldn't say produces hydrogen ions. I should say the respiratory system changes the direction of this reaction therefore changing the amount of hydrogen ions in solution. Let me show you what I mean here. You know that the respiratory system eliminates carbon dioxide from our bodies. That happens with every cycle of ventilation. So exhalation, expiration, you get rid of CO2. When you increase your rate of ventilation, you actually get rid of more CO2. That can't be emphasized enough. Yes, it's true that you take in more oxygen, but what's more important, well, sort of more important, is that CO2 levels will decrease. So when CO2 levels decrease, due to the law of mass action, you have less of this product, CO2. The reaction will be driven towards the left. That means that hydrogen ions will be consumed. And if hydrogen ions are consumed, the pH raises, or rises, I should say. You get a rise in pH. If instead the ventilation rate decreases or it's lowered, you breathe slower, your CO2 level increases as long as you're still producing the same amount. Our ventilation decreases when we sleep, but we're not producing as much CO2. So we're talking about impaired ventilation here. The CO2 level would increase. When CO2 increases, that drives this reaction to the right. And so more hydrogen ions are produced. And when more hydrogen ions are produced, that lowers the pH. So the integrity and health of our respiratory system plays a role in our pH balance in our bodies. Okay, now let's look at how the kidneys or the urinary system can help with acid-base balance. The biggest role that the kidneys perform is to buffer acids, particularly in the proximal convoluted tubule. Some in the distal convoluted tubule as well, but mainly in the proximal convoluted tubule. And so it really does more to, the kidney really does more to buffer acid than it does to buffer base, but it can buffer base by just doing this acid buffering less, but that's kind of the cart before the horse. So if this is your urine or forming urine, the filtrate, you likely have carbon dioxide and water in there, came from the blood. And so that formed carbonic acid, and carbonic acid actually dissociates anyway. And the kidney tubule, the proximal convoluted tubule, takes up the carbon dioxide, which combines inside the cell with intracellular water to form carbonic acid again, which seems a little strange. And then that carbonic acid dissociates, and hydrogen ions can be secreted into the nephron. Now, this secretion of hydrogen ions into the tubule, getting rid of hydrogen ions, putting them into the forming urine, is linked to reabsorption of sodium. It's also linked to the reabsorption of bicarbonate. So what the kidney does to buffer acids is to put hydrogen ions in the urine and to reabsorb any bicarbonate or base back into the bloodstream. It's pretty cool. So in lab, we'll have a chance to talk about disorders of acid-base balance, and I'm just going to introduce the concept to you here. You know that the normal range of blood pH is 7.35 to 7.45. And in the blood, If the pH of the blood was less than 7.35, we would call that acidemia because we're talking about the blood. If the pH was above 7.45, we would call it alkalemia. But for some reason, unknown to me exactly why, we usually use the terms acidosis and alkalosis instead. These terms mean the same thing, but they refer to any body fluid, not just the blood. So acidosis is a condition where pH is below 7.35, and alkalosis is a condition where the pH is above 7.45. And so most of these acidosis and alkalosis disorders that we're going to talk about are due to accompanying sodium and potassium imbalances. Particularly acidosis, you'll see high potassium, and that affects the nervous system. So there's some reason to really pay attention to the pH of extracellular fluid, intracellular fluid, and blood. So some causes of acid-base imbalances. I just want to first talk about respiratory causes because they're the most straightforward. If you have a respiratory disorder that decreases ventilation, hypoventilation, that means that CO2 is going to be high, at least higher than the rate of elimination. An example, and then you know you're going to get acidosis because carbon dioxide will combine with water and that'll produce carbonic acid and you'll have excess hydrogen ions around. An example of a respiratory cause of acidosis would be emphysema. And that's because air gets trapped and exhalation is difficult. And so the body tends to retain CO2. A respiratory cause of alkalosis or high pH would be due to hyperventilation, like with anxiety, for example. And now CO2 is eliminated faster than it's produced. And so the amount of carbonic acid in general goes down, and so your pH raises. Now there are many other causes of acidosis and alkalosis, including kidney dysfunction. But there's metabolic disorders such as diabetes or ingesting certain substances that can cause acidosis or alkalosis, as well as vomiting and diarrhea. So we just lump anything that's not respiratory, a respiratory cause, we lump it into this category called metabolic causes. So causes of acidosis that are not respiratory but due to something else could be due to kidney disease, because remember, kidneys get rid of excess acid and they reabsorb base into our body. So kidney failure usually results in acidosis of body fluids. Diabetes also causes acidosis because even though there's a lot of glucose around in the blood, the cells can't use that glucose. So cells resort to breaking down fats primarily, and that produces lactic acid and ketone bodies, which are also acidic. So these cells will become acidic, and eventually the hydrogen ions, maybe in the form of CO2, will leave the cells and get out into the extracellular fluid. So diabetes would be a cause of acidosis. Aspirin causes acidosis. I don't know the exact mechanism. I'm sure it has something to do with hydrogen ion pumps. And chronic diarrhea actually causes acidosis. And that's because with chronic diarrhea, you end up losing a lot of pancreatic juice and bile. I mean, we're talking chronic going on for a long time. With certain bacterial and viral infections, for example. And the the pancreatic juice and the bile have bicarbonate in them. And so if you're getting rid of those, you're getting rid of bicarbonate and you're not able to buffer any hydrogens produced during normal metabolism. So there are metabolic causes of alkalosis as well, but it's much more rare. It could be the loss of stomach acid due to chronic vomiting. And it's not so much that you've lost the stomach acid from your stomach, but your stomach is still going to keep trying to produce more stomach acid, and so it'll pump more hydrogen ions from the extracellular fluid into the stomach, but you'll lose it, and it'll just keep trying to make more and more acid, so you'll eventually become alkaline. That would be some pretty serious vomiting. Maybe what's more common, I don't know if more is right, maybe in little kids or something, is consumption of an enormous amount of antacids. Like some little kid thinks that Tums are candy, and so they use antacids. Or if somebody uses antacids all day long for many days in a row. So those are the causes of acid-base imbalances. And if they are not corrected by either the chemical buffers and, the respiratory system and or the urinary system, without clinical intervention, this is what you're going to get, acidosis or alkalosis. So we call this uncompensated. The body's not compensating for the loss of either acid or base. And so your blood pH will be really abnormal. And the way that pH imbalances are detected is by first a blood test. They look at venous blood and measure the bicarbonate levels. They can also measure directly either venous or arterial pH. But then to get a level of carbon dioxide, which you want to do if you want to detect whether it's a respiratory cause or not, you have to use arterial blood. And so an artery, usually around the wrist, is used to extract blood, and a blood gas using a chromatography is used to measure the amount of CO2. And there are normal ranges for CO2 within the blood. There's normal ranges for bicarbonate within the blood, and of course we already know that there's a normal range for pH. And what we're going to see is that in uncompensated disorders that have caused a pH imbalance, you'll see that a pH imbalance will go pretty low. We'll say like 7 or 6.8. Death happens pretty quickly, actually. I can't remember what it is, but and then you could also see a disorder alkaline, up to 8 or something like that. But what's more common is to try to detect slight pH imbalances that are, well, I don't know if they're slight, but pH imbalances that are already being compensated for with the body. So if you actually look at the pH of either venous or arterial blood, the imbalance will be almost undetectable because either the urinary or the respiratory system is compensating. And so if there is an imbalance that's being compensated, the pH will hover right at 7.35 or 7.45, but not go to extremes. So in lab, we'll talk about what you see and how you predict when there's uncompensated pH imbalance versus compensated and what the cause might be. Now, kidneys can compensate for any pH imbalance that's caused by a respiratory disorder. or any other metabolic cause that's not related to the kidney. But the respiratory system can compensate for pH imbalances that are caused by anything else that's not the respiratory system. Like somebody that has diabetes, let's say they're experiencing acidosis. The respiratory system could hyperventilate to get rid of more CO2 and thereby get rid of more hydrogen ions. So we'll discuss this more with examples in lab. Thank you very much for listening.